Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on performative gender and religions in South Asia. We are discussing Sanskrit Dramaturgy and Rasa theory. Today our discussion will be in the light of Śūdraka's Mṛcchakatika. Mṛcchakatika means the little clay cart. Śūdraka's Mṛcchakatika is one of the earliest known Sanskrit plays, and it is assumed to have been written by Śūdraka, who was a king that ruled between the 3rd and 5th centuries BC. Mṛcchakatika comprises 10 acts. It is a 10-act drama about the story of Charudatta, right? Charudatta, who is an honest but impoverished Brahmin native of Ujjaini, and his love interest Vasantasena, a beautiful and a pure-hearted courtesan from the same city. The play is entirely built on Śūdraka's imagination, and it does not draw inspiration from any previously written epic, either primary or secondary epics. Mṛcchakatika is unique in several ways within the entire corpus of the classical Sanskrit tradition and artworks. The play is one of the best examples of Prakarana. Prakarana, which is one of the 10 types of Roopaks. Now, let us understand what Prakarana is. Prakarana is a prominent type of Sanskrit theatre, which etymologically means to do something perfectly. And Mṛcchakatika is the only Sanskrit drama that embodies this spirit of Prakarana. Now, we see that Prakrit and Sanskrit, these two traditions, have very different set of audience. Prakrit became an efficient vehicle of communication in Śūdraka's hands when he is writing Mṛcchakatika, and it did justice to express the complex mental processes of the common people, people that are not necessarily linked to the royal lineages, the royal personages. And so it, in a way, it is the mouthpiece. It finds itself as expressing the sentiments, the voices of the common, the grassroots and the uneducated. Since Prakrit as a dialect was closer to the life's realities, it left a peculiar, a typical impact on the reader and the viewer. This is to say that it is definitely a language closer to the common man, directly identifiable with the common man's sentiments. Prakrit, with its rich vocabulary of the dialect and the drama in Prakrit being packed with movements, gestures, attitudes of the characters, was able to accomplish what a fully developed and a highly sophisticated Sanskrit tradition might have possibly not achieved, something that might have not been achieved by the fully developed Sanskrit tradition in terms of plebeian representation, a more inclusive, a more comprehensive representation of the then society. So, Sanskrit is characterized by its brevity, its suggestion and emphasis. Prakrit, on the other hand, gains its agency or its meaning through colloquial usage, local forms and usage, and the combination of Sanskrit with Prakrit in this play is doing wonders for the depth of communication. We see in Mṛcchakatika communication happening at different levels where we employ both Prakrit and Sanskrit here. The guiding principle in Mṛcchakatika is the comic approach. It holds the message, it holds out the message that the main function of art, as Bharat Muni himself would agree, is to entertain and let people know that a society might be very difficult and complex to handle, but in the end, all the problems are manageable. So, some kind of optimistic note. The issue in Mṛcchakatika is this crisis that manifests itself in the protagonist's circumstance. The protagonist is a victim of circumstances, and he is rendered poor by these different negative things happening in his life. So, coming back to Prakarana, a Prakarana must represent contemporary society and culture. Mṛcchakatika is not an exception in this sense, and the play may be viewed as a study of social realism. It is written through the prism of social realism. The play chooses a theme of love, but then a very unconventional type of love that is taking place between a bankrupt Brahmin merchant Charudatta and a rich courtesan Vasantasena, and this love story is set boldly against a backdrop of contemporary urban society, which does not so much derive its essence from the literary wealth of the Puranas and the epics. Mṛcchakatika is a remarkable work in the tradition of ancient Sanskrit literature. It's a play about a realistic picture of metropolitan India's socio-political situation at that time. So, Mṛcchakatika ideally cannot be called as a nataka or a natakya kriti. In that sense, natak denotes the representation of the sacred and the godly in a form that indicates the lofty and profound. And in the typical idea of nataka, the Sanskrit nataka, the life of the ordinary people, the lives of the ordinary people are not covered, not so much shown. Mṛcchakatika is not accorded the value of high drama in which kings, gods and mythological beings predominate. And this is the, like I said, the usual trait of Sanskrit artwork. Instead, the category of Mṛcchakatika is a Prakarana. So, a lot of critics would say, they are of the opinion that had the play been about courtly affairs, including some kind of change in polity or political order, had it been about the lofty questions of wars among kings and sustaining or confiscating of enormous territories, had it been about the grand affairs, it could have had a better footing, a better visibility. This work by Śūdraka is a Prakarana type, and it is representing the episode of Charudatta's, affair with Vasantasena, and it in the end, closes with a happy union. So, the fundamental requirement of a Prakarana, the class to which Mṛcchakatika belongs, is that a drama be inventive or original in nature, that the narrative should be a creation of the poet. It should be kavi kalpita. It should be in the kalpana, in the creative, imagination of the poet. It should be based on worldly life and centered on the acts of men and women. So, as are the requirements of the type of this composition, Prakarana, the main theme in Mṛcchakatika has been presented in 10 acts, and the predominant sentiment or rasa is love or shringar, and the Nayak's trait is dhira prashanta, deep and calm. Charudatta is represented through deep and calm traits. As a Prakarana, the hero of Mṛcchakatika a Brahmin named Charudatta is a very generous young man. We see that because of his charitable nature, his contributions to unward the unlucky friends, and also due to his general public welfare, he is doomed. He has become bankrupted and impoverished. And yet, despite his poor living conditions, he has maintained a reputation in Ujjaini as an honest and upright man, endowed with the rare gift of knowledge. And many men continue to seek his advice, right? So he completely defies the stereotype of the greedy Brahmin that was also forming. We have this figure being represented through one of the stock types of Vidushak. I have already discussed that. Charudatta is just the opposite of that. He has lost all his material wealth, but he is spiritually so pure, and he is such a respectable man that even despite his poverty, the denizens of Ujjaini respect and honor him for his knowledge and his character. So, Charudatta has two heroines. One is Dhuta, who is born of a noble family, and she is therefore a Kulaja. On the other hand, we have the main heroine Vasantasena, who is a public woman or a Ganika. This kind of intermixing of, or bringing two types of women in juxtaposition is unusual in Sanskrit drama. On the one hand, we have the Kulaja, a woman, a high-born woman. On the other hand, we have the main heroine who is a Ganika, a courtesan. This makes the composition of Mṛcchakatika a mixed or Samkirna type of Prakarana. The protagonist of the play, Charudatta, as such does not belong to a noble or royal lineage. He is not related to kings. And we see that Vasantasena is a courtesan, and yet she bears exemplary attitude and very dignified behavior that impresses the audience. So, the nobility of these characters are not derived from their social status or from their birth, but for the individual virtues and behavior that they possess, right? Mṛcchakatika has a tale which is understood as partly real and partly the author's imagination, and it is not so much derived from any epic material. It is not drawing so much on epic material. Śūdraka emphasizes his imagination and his creative force, which provides the greatest form of theatre known as the drama of creation. So, a Prakarana is different from a nataka. This is something I have been telling earlier also. The most significant distinction between Prakarana and nataka is that a Prakarana does not derive its content from the epic tradition, but rather from the playwright's innovations or creativity. The length is typically between 5 to 10 acts of various lengths. Each act could be of various lengths. The characters are derived from the society's middle and lower classes. So, a king, if at all present, is very rarely seen in a Prakarana. Either the king is not there altogether or the king is rarely present. The themes are primarily about mundane acts of vengeance, political intrigues and familial feuds. In a way, we see that there are clear similarities between what the Prakarana is trying to depict and the classical European comedy, which is defined by Aristotle. The action in the case of Prakarana takes place primarily on the streets outside of the palace. So, it is not confined to the precincts of the palace, and the setting is nearly always urban and metropolitan, and it is secular in nature. It is not otherworldly. In many ways, a Prakarana is a more inclusive representation of its contemporary time, and it contains a more sharp, a more incisive social commentary as compared to Nataka. Mṛcchakatika is deeply influenced by the political upheaval and personal intrigues. The figure of this villain that we have, his name is Samsthanaka, also known as Shakara. So, Samsthanaka or Shakara is a vulgar courtier who is aggressively pursuing Vasantasena. His longing for Vasantasena, his desire to overpower Vasantasena, and his fruitless attempts play a key role in this drama. He is constantly, in very vulgar fashion, trying to overtake or trying to overpower this courtesan Vasantasena, and his futile attempts form a major theme in the play. So, Samsthanaka appears to be a fool and a villain, and his villainy is derived, is defined by his pettiness, right? And we also have the figure of Sarvilaka, the thief, that adds to the play's humorous tone. So, that's basically where Prakarana is coming from. It deals with the anomalous characters in the society that do not find any mention typically in a Sanskrit artwork. We have the thief who evokes laughter. We have a villain who is more funny than pejorative or harmful. His overtures, his wrong overtures, wrong approaches to Vasantasena makes him a very petty villain. And in the end, the protagonists themselves are also very, they are a departure from the typical or the traditional idea of noble. They are not noble in the sense of being born in lofty families. One is a Ganika, the other is a bankrupt, Brahmin, and the concept of a Brahmin trader wanting to marry a courtesan itself is also very unusual, very unconventional, usually sneered at. People would scoff and sneer at such an idea, but he successfully unites with Vasantasena in the end. So, a lot of social bars, a lot of social, gaps or kind of social bar, like I was saying, differences are overcome through a Prakarana, an unusual writing such as Mṛcchakatika. It defies, it plays around, and finally resists a lot of stereotype. It is also, in a way, mixed nature, its hybrid nature goes on to say a lot of things. For example, the fact that Sanskrit plays deal only with noble lives and noble matters, noble affairs, royal affairs. Here we see that we have the hero who is not a king or a minister, right? At the same time, it is revisiting the stereotype of the greedy Brahmin, a Brahmin that can be very poor and yet such a respectable character. A courtesan, the stock character or the stereotypical character of courtesan is that of a lewd woman, a lascivious woman. Here we see Vasantasena as so upright and so dignified that revisits the entire idea of Ganika. So, it is in a way playing around with all these stereotypes, and the fact, like I said, that Sanskrit belongs only to or deals only with upper class affairs or lofty affairs. Here it is a very secular, a very mundane theme being dealt with, and it is very all inclusive, where even a villain, even a thief finds his place or is mentioned somewhere in the narrative. And even the idea of a king is revisited, given that Śūdraka himself is a king. He is a king who is making this kind of an experimentation. He is mixing the Sanskrit with the Prakrit. So, a king's interest in the common affairs, the urban common affairs, in social realism is fantastic. It is remarkably and very notably represented in Mṛcchakatika. So the drama concludes with Charudatta's unexpected turn of fate, the exposure of the miscreants or the villains, and eventually a political victory and a happy romantic union. With this, I'm going to stop my lecture here today, and let's meet again with another round of discussions in another lecture. Thank you.